call the meeting to order and continue our study on the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorism Financing Act review. With us we have from the Government of British Columbia the Attorney General, Mr. Honourable David Eby. Minister Eby, welcome. Sorry for delaying you. Do you have electronic voting in BC? We could certainly use it here.
Not yet, Mr. Chair. We're working on it.
The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Just practicing with my earpiece here. It's a pleasure to be here at the committee. I wanted to thank the committee very much for the invitation to come to present to you today and to answer your questions. One of the reasons why I felt it was particularly valuable to take you up on this invitation is I believe we have a very serious issue, and we are in need of concerted federal effort and assistance in dealing with it. And I really wanted to bring that message to the committee personally. And I'd like to share with you a few remarks and a bit of a narrative about my experience as becoming a new minister in British Columbia. I was sworn in July as Attorney General with responsibility for gambling. And that was really when my eyes were opened about some of the activities that have been taking place in British Columbia. So it was on one of my first days as Minister responsible for gambling when I was briefed by our provincial regulator as part of the briefings I received as a new minister responsible. And the first words that I heard at that briefing from a member of our regulator, the Gaming Policy Enforcement Branch, the first words were, quote, "I think we are going to blow your mind," unquote. And Mr. Chair, I can advise my mind was indeed blown. The regulator walked me through extensive and overwhelming evidence of large-scale money laundering in British Columbia Lower Mainland casinos. I was shown video and photographs of individuals wheeling large suitcases packed with $20 bills, others bringing stacks of cash to casino cages. I was astounded by the audacity of those involved. On a purely practical matter, $800,000 in 20s is very heavy. It looked like they were helping somebody move a box of books. But I was equally astounded that this activity had been taking place in British Columbia without an effective criminal, legal, regulatory, or policy response for almost a decade. There have been, to my knowledge, no related criminal charges or tax prosecutions to date related to the activity that I witnessed. Suspicious cash transactions began climbing at BC casinos in 2009, following the defunding of BC's provincial integrated casino policing team. Large suspicious cash transactions continued unabated from 2009 until late 2017, when our new government instructed BC casinos that they should no longer accept large cash transactions where they didn't know where the cash was coming from. And we're still not done yet in terms of solving this problem. I retained anti-money laundering expert Dr. Peter German, a former senior RCMP officer, the author of Canada's leading textbook on anti-money laundering law, who has been investigating and reviewing what has happened in British Columbia and will advise me in a report that I will receive at the end of this month about how the province, at the provincial level, can address this problem. At the federal level, I would really like for this committee to understand the colossal nature of the regulatory failure that took place and frankly, may still be taking place in British Columbia. The issue in British Columbia is so notorious and so severe that I was briefed on an international intelligence community training session in which international intelligence members were taught about something called the Vancouver model of money laundering. We are famous internationally, or more accurately, we become infamous for money laundering. In the Vancouver model of money laundering, a wealthy individual from China, a country with strict currency export controls, wants to gamble. A gangster will meet that gambler at a casino, offering cash in amounts as high as hundreds of thousands of dollars. In one transaction, $1.2 million in cash. The cash is the proceeds of gang crime. To pay for the To pay for the cash, the gambler agrees to transfer money in China from his bank account into a bank account under the control of the gang. The gambler walks the illicit cash into the casino, completes a FinTrack reporting form, buys chips, gambles, and on leaving either cashes out, receiving a check, or carries the chips out of the casino. In sum, the criminal gang has successfully laundered difficult-to-manage $20 bills, moving the money out of Canada while keeping their names off of FinTrack forms. Those involved in the transaction can truthfully report that everyone is following all of the reporting rules. FinTrack will aggressively audit and confirm that the reports have been made accurately. The only real evidence of a problem is a guy lugging a hockey bag full of $20 bills into the casino. And you might think that that alone would be enough to start a police investigation or a Revenue Canada investigation. It has not been. BC's casino policing team was funded again and resurrected with a better mandate in 2016 and is now unsurprisingly but thankfully involved in a massive transnational criminal investigation. Now, I'd like to thank those who work at FinTrack. I believe they collect critically important information and ensure it is accurate. The issue is not their fault, but there is a problem. An anti-money laundering system that rigorously enforces compliance with reporting but does not have an enforcement arm puts a sheep mask on a wolf's face. While I know it is not true, I picture submitted FinTrack forms being picked up by a lonely person at a fax machine in a giant warehouse, putting the reports into boxes, and the warehouse is filled with boxes from floor to ceiling as far as the eye can see. Although this is clearly not the actual situation, it may as well be true given the apparent lack of action in British Columbia for casino money launderers. Unfortunately, the impact of FinTrack reporting in BC has been that any criticism of allowing massive cash transactions with money from unknown sources could be answered simply, quote, "We comply with all federal anti-money laundering reporting rules," unquote. I have no confidence that any enforcement or investigation action would result from a report submitted this afternoon with the words "highly suspicious" in all caps and triple underlined. In fact, I believe the current reporting system actually reduces the possibility of action because the individual completing the form would mistakenly believe that writing "highly suspicious" on the form and then submitting it was the same as reporting it to police. It is not the same. Unfortunately, if FinTrack has been concerned about a lack of action on their reports, they have been unable or unwilling to speak publicly about that lack of action. That needs to change. British Columbians take no comfort in the suggestion that this is somehow limited to casinos. We will be asking Dr. Dermott to take on a second phase, this time looking into real estate, following highly publicized reports of a link between money laundering and our real estate market in British Columbia. Now, Dr. Dermott has requested that I provide you with his interim federally focused recommendations given the timing of your committee and the timing of his report. It's a little bit like getting the last page of the book without receiving the book itself. I do have the recommendations for the committee here for you today, Mr. Chair, but unfortunately, I didn't receive them in time for them to be translated for the committee. So I'm in your hands about the best way to ensure the committee receives them. Important work with the federal government is happening behind the scenes, and I'm grateful for that support of the federal government. I'm appearing here so that all members of federal parliament, and as best as possible, all Canadians, can understand why we are asking for more support from Revenue Canada, the RCMP, and other federal agencies. We certainly hope for the federal parliament supports for any interventions that are proposed by the government. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, and thank you for your candor. On the recommendations, just leave them with the clerk and we'll get them translated. And do we have to hold them as confidential until such time as the report is released? Or
no, Mr. Chair, they can be public.
Okay. Dan, point of order or what?
No, just I was going to ask to see if it'd be possible just to have, depending on how long the recommendations are, Minister, perhaps you could read them into the record, and then we can ask questions about it. Would that work for everyone? Because then at least they're in the record, both in French and English, and because we'd hate to have the resource here and then to think we passed the opportunity because we didn't have translation.
I think that's a fair suggestion. If you could, Minister, do you mind doing that?
Not at all, Mr. Chair. I'd be glad to do that.
Okay.
Maybe I will.
Sir.
Yes, I think I'll skip the background
just we could
paragraphs
go
and
to the
focus on the recommendations themselves. Just. I'm starting at, for reference, when you receive the official document, I'll start at paragraph 14, under the heading, the legal profession. Without question, the absence of reporting by lawyers is a significant gap in Canada and is a significant impediment to police investigations involving the movement of money through real estate and other financial sectors. Canada is an outlier here as well. Other common law jurisdictions, including the United Kingdom, have robust protections in place which require financial reporting by lawyers. Quite frankly, consultation has occurred for years. There is a real need for legislation which can withstand a charter challenge and requires the reporting of monies held in lawyer trust accounts. The irony is that in British Columbia, most personal real estate transactions are handled by notaries who do report to FINTRAC. It is hard to rationalize why their handling of money should be treated differently than that of lawyers. Under the heading High-Risk Sectors, the consultation paper lists several businesses and persons to which the legislation could be extended through amendments to the POCML-TFA. It is something akin to whack-a-mole as FINTRAC attempts to close gaps with vulnerable sectors that do not currently report. Of interest are the following, under the heading Par Mutual or Horse Racing Sector. GPEB currently, that's the Gaming Policy Enforcement Branch in British Columbia, GPEB currently regulates this industry. I am not aware that BC has ever examined the prevalence of money laundering in the horse racing sector. Reporting requirements would certainly shed light on what is occurring. Under the heading Auto Dealers, it is well documented that the criminal lifestyle is often attracted to expensive consumer goods such as luxury cars and pleasure craft. Due to their high value, these items are also excellent places in which illegal cash can be reintroduced to the legitimate economy during the integration phase of the laundering process. Luxury items are of interest because there is no tracking by government of cash purchases. They are not reportable transactions to FINTRAC. Vancouver has been described as the #1 supercar city in North America. Also, auto dealers in Greater Vancouver are among the highest new and used luxury car dealers in Canada by sales volume. In essence, an individual can walk into a luxury auto dealership and purchase a high-end vehicle with $400,000 cash. The only obstacle will be dealership policies. An incredibly large number of curbers, unregulated intermediaries, are believed to be operating in BC, and a vigorous awareness campaign is underway to alert British Columbians of the dangers inherent in dealing with curbers. The fact that these are all cash-based activities make them extremely vulnerable to the introduction of dirty money. Under the heading Company Service Providers, this high-risk sector is relevant to the issue of beneficial ownership. Pardon me, Mr. Chair. It's difficult to pull out the recommendations because clearly they are part of a larger integrated document. Maybe I'll start from a little bit earlier because I think I might be able to get through the 2 pages that would give some context. Okay. On February 7, 2018, the Minister of Finance released a public consultation paper with respect to POCML-TFA. Parliamentary committee hearings on the statute are taking place this month in Ottawa. Since 1989, Canada's criminal code has contained the offence of laundering as well as possession of the proceeds of crime. In 1993, Parliament enacted a federal statute which required financial institutions to keep records of certain transactions. That legislation was replaced in 2000 by the POCML-TFA, I'll call it the Act from here on in, which has been amended many times since. The Act moved Canada from a recording to a reporting regime and created Canada's Financial Intelligence Unit, FINTRAC. The legislation was a response to international commitments made by Canada. Although the criminal code falls under the purview of the Attorney General of Canada, the Minister of Finance is accountable for the Act. Approximately 100,000 businesses and financial institutions are now required to report large cash transaction reports and suspicious transaction reports to FINTRAC. Some industries have additional reporting requirements. In this regard, casinos must also report cash disbursement reports. FINTRAC performs audits on reporting entities and does so every 2 years at BC's casinos. It has the power to impose administrative monetary penalties. The largest penalty ever imposed with respect to casinos was meted out to BCLC in 2010. BCLC, the BC Lottery Corporation, appealed the administrative monetary penalty to the federal court. The case was resolved in 2016 in what is best described as a draw. By this time, FINTRAC was satisfied with the quality of BCLC reporting. In addition, its entire administrative monetary penalty structure had been called into question because of unrelated cases which questioned the lack of objective criteria being used to determine the quantum of a penalty. I'll skip ahead, Mr. Chair. It is beneficial to review the latest FATF mutual evaluation of Canada's legislation, which points to various deficiencies in Canada's existing scheme. In the past, it has almost always been through this form of international peer pressure that substantive changes have been made to Canada's various criminal and other federal legislation related to proceeds of crime, money laundering, and corruption. The FATF review and then can be found at, and then the link is provided. There are numerous references to casinos in the FATF report. I will not comment on the issues of beneficial ownership and whistleblowers, of which the Minister is already very familiar and are covered in some depth in the consultation document. So, Mr. Chair, I hope that was of some use to the committee to provide a little bit of an overview of the contents of that recommendation document. As I say, it is a piece of a much larger report that we're expecting to receive at the end of the month.
Yeah, and some of those points are raised in the Department of Finance discussion paper as well related to the FATF. Okay, we'll turn to questions, and we'll go to 5-minute rounds rather than the regular 7. Mr. Fergus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for your report. And also thank you for really just very quickly, given the time that you've been in office, have really drilled down on an important and I think a huge issue for Canada and for certainly for British Columbia in dealing with the proceeds from money laundering and terrorist financing. I really appreciate also how you pointed out the loophole that we seem to have in terms of dealing with how the criminal element can be using casinos to launder their money. I'm very interested, though, and you made passing reference to it, but it's also it's come out in a lot of testimony. It came out in the Department of Finance's report as well. It's a question of beneficial ownership. And I was wondering if you could give us a sense as to what British Columbia is doing in terms of increasing the transparency, in terms of beneficial ownership, in terms of corporations, private corporations that are registered on the provincial books, and how British Columbia would like to see Ottawa work cooperatively with it to perhaps establish a national registry. Canadian registry, I should say.
Thank you very much, Member, for the question. The issue of beneficial ownership has been particularly acute in British Columbia as a result of our out-of-control real estate market. Metro Vancouver's real estate market was reviewed by Transparency International Canada, where they looked at the top 100 properties by value in the assessment authority, and then they looked at the land title registrations for those properties. And they found that for almost half of those properties, it was impossible to determine who the true owner of the property was. The properties were held by international trusts or by companies where the sole director was, for example, a lawyer, or were owned by a student or a housewife. And so the recommendations from that report, quite obviously, were of significant interest to British Columbians who note that the average price for a home for a family in Metro Vancouver far exceeds what the average salary is for a family. And so people ask the question naturally, where is the money coming from? It's been a priority for our government. The Minister of Finance has committed to establishing a land title registry in British Columbia in which the beneficial owner of the property must be declared. We're looking at international examples. I understand that the United Kingdom has adopted a beneficial ownership land registry based on similar concerns, and we anticipate introducing that in British Columbia. There is also a significant opportunity for British Columbia around corporate beneficial ownership. The province of Alberta has a beneficial ownership scheme for their corporate entities. I think it's really important to underline how important it is for there to be a Canadian standard around corporate and land registry beneficial ownership, because what we'll do is we'll end up displacing the activity. If in British Columbia you have to declare beneficial ownership, well, no problem, we'll just move the money somewhere else. And I wouldn't wish the kind of issues that we've seen in British Columbia on other jurisdictions in Canada, and so I think a national standard would be welcome there. We've had good support, and I understand there's great interest among the federal government officials and elected members around introducing beneficial ownership disclosure requirements, and I hope that we can work together on that and ensuring national standards.
What standards would like to see the federal government adopt, or what standards, or if you prefer, what standards is British Columbia going to be adopting for beneficial for land registry and for beneficial ownership of private corporations?
The policy work is still ongoing, and we'll be introducing legislation based on that policy work. But the bottom line for British Columbians is they want to know who's owning the property, and they want to know where the money's coming from. And I think that the concern that I want to bring to this committee is an increasing lack of confidence in British Columbia around the enforcement of tax evasion, enforcement of laws related to tax evasion, and the enforcement of laws related to the laundering of money. And I do understand that there are logistical issues around the index offense, and there may be a need to revisit these kind of pieces. But the fact that we don't know who owns almost half of the most valuable properties in Vancouver, and we don't know where the money came from, is really disturbing to a lot of British Columbians, and that will be the mischief at which this legislative reform is aimed.
Sorry, Greg, we're out of time. Turning to Mr. Albas, is that report available, Minister, publicly?
Yes, it is.
Then we will find it and we'll give it to committee members.
The author, Mr. Chair, is Adam Ross, and it's Transparency International Canada. I believe it's titled "Nothing to Hide."
Okay, thank you, Mr. Albas. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for coming from British Columbia and making the sojourn to be with us today. I'd like to just first start. You've mentioned a number of areas where FINTRAC can be utilized in a different way to serve more than what it currently does right now. They do important work. I've floated the idea of allowing FINTRAC legislatively to aggregate its data so that policymakers such as yourself in British Columbia can actually see the overall picture of how many cash sales are being done, perhaps that are not being picked up by Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation or OSFI because they are provincially regulated mortgages. And I think that it may, that information is being collected now, but FINTRAC legislatively is not allowed to share information beyond an individual case and refer it for either terrorism investigation or for organized crime, or for other money laundering. Would you be supportive as a policymaker from British Columbia to see personal data being aggregated in such a way that it won't affect any privacy laws, but will give policymakers such as yourself a better lens?
Thank you, member, very much for that question. One of the great frustrations has certainly, as someone charged with responsibility for ensuring adherence to the rule of law in British Columbia, has been that we learn about what's happening in our real estate market or in our casinos through journalists. Sam Cooper, Post Media, Kathy Tomlinson of the Globe and Mail are the ones who are providing a lot of the information, and that is that is obviously not a desired situation. We need to be ahead of this activity when it's publicly released in the newspaper. Means we're behind the criminals. I think that one of the great opportunities is exactly what you said, is better information sharing. I think that FINTRAC has incredible information. I think that they see trends years before we recognize them at the provincial level. We have all kinds of provincial legislative authority that we can levy to address different issues, but we have to know what they are. And anything you can do to provide or facilitate FINTRAC sharing that information proactively with the provincial government level, I think would be a great benefit.
So, Minister, when it comes to the casinos, and I am quite alert to the case, first of all, do you believe that BC is the only jurisdiction in Canada that has this issue with money laundering? Are you an outlier? Or is this something that should be analyzed right across to see if there are other provinces that have similar? Have you heard from any other provincial counterpart of yours in regards to this?
I was the critic responsible for gaming for a couple of years in opposition before becoming minister responsible. And I had raised the issue of large cash transactions in our casinos, and the answer that invariably came back, whether it was from people in the industry or whether it was from government, was that everybody was adhering to, and there were extensive audits and reviews of the reporting regime, and that as a result we could all have confidence that money laundering was not happening, that the proceeds of crime, to quote the former finance minister, were not welcome in BC casinos. Obviously, that was not the case. And I unfortunately don't know what's happening in other provinces, and I can't speak to that. But what I can say is that I have no reason to think that criminal gangs confine themselves to Metro Vancouver, or that they don't share information about how things can work. But there are some significant differences when I look at, for example, Ontario, that have much larger police force and casinos than we did in British Columbia. We didn't even have a regulator present in the casinos outside of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and I'm sure none of the members in this House frequent frequent casinos. But if you've ever found yourself in a casino, and the moments when I have in social occasions, it tends not to be Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And so we needed to have the regulator in place in the casino evenings and weekends, which was when this activity was taking place. And so I apologize, member, for taking all your time in this answer, but we had a pretty unique situation in BC in terms of a lack of regulatory presence in our casinos, provincial government that, in my opinion, did not take the actions necessary to clamp down on this. I hope it's not the case in other provinces, but I don't know.
So, as the minister responsible now, the system, and I do realize you have recommendations coming. You've made recommendations here, and I commend you and your government for coming this far to talk about the federal component. But why have you not set up a task force or set up an edict directly limiting that no more than $10,000 of monies can be accepted any one time? Why have you said we will no longer accept the practice of suitcases of $20 bills? I think those are 100% within your power. Why have you not done that?
Yeah, thank you, member, for the question. I filed those recommendations under the common sense category, and we have actually implemented them. We implemented in December of last year a requirement that casinos not accept cash where they don't know the origin in excess of $10,000, where they don't know where that cash came from. And I can tell you it's been incredibly successful. Our February total for suspicious cash transactions was $200,000. The July 2015 total for suspicious cash transactions was $20 million. So we've reduced it by a factor of 100. But I don't believe that solves the problem. I believe that money has moved elsewhere, and I also believe we have a concern that needs to be dealt with bank drafts.
Thank you both. Mr. Julian.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eby, for being here. I know it's a 10,000 kilometer return trip, so it's very good of you to give your expertise and your knowledge about this. I find it surprising that the former government appeared to be aware of all of these problems and chose not to actually make the public aware of the difficulties and what was actually taking place in British Columbia's casinos. Can you run us briefly through when a report was actually produced by the former government and when that report actually came to light that allowed the public to become aware of the extent of the problem?
Thank you, member, for the question. One of the questions that I asked Dr. German was to advise me on how we got to this situation in British Columbia. And so that's one of the questions he will be providing information about. There are some pieces that are already in the public domain. In 2009, when our integrated casino team, which received $1 million per year in provincial funding, was defunded, there was a report that was prepared in advance of that to make recommendations about how to reform that team so it would be more effective. And it advised the government at that time, in 2009, that there were criminal organizations operating in BC casinos, that they were laundering the proceeds of crime through BC casinos, and that there were extensive illegal gambling houses in the Lower Mainland. The government decided to move ahead with the defunding of the team. I believe that was a critical error and a very significant one that resulted in the situation that we faced. There were a number of internal memos. There were individuals within the Gaming Policy Enforcement Branch, likely within the BC Lottery Corporation, as they had shared responsibility that were providing information to the ministry about this. There was an audit prepared by a third-party business firm called MNP into this specific activity. The report was not released to the public. It was about a year before I was elected. That report was completed. It was not released to the public. I released it shortly after taking responsibility for the file when I was briefed on it, because I believe the public deserved to know what was happening in BC casinos. And I believe the government made a decision not to release that report, in my opinion, because they were unprepared to take the action necessary, given the implications it would have for the provincial proceeds that come from gambling, because people who were bringing this money into the casino were actually gambling, and I don't want to let any secrets out in front of the committee, but they were losing because the House always wins. And so they were losing significant amounts of money, and the province was making money from this activity.
So a report was actually produced and was withheld for over a year, and during that time, of course, there was a provincial election, so the former BC Liberal government just withheld that information from the public. Now, can you tell us the consequences of that delay over 15 months? You mentioned July 2015, $20 million of what we call snow washing, or basically money laundering, huge amounts passing through the casinos. What were the consequences of waiting for that year?
The peak of the activity, according to the reports that have been filed in BC, was in July of 2015, when $13.5 million in $20 bills went through BC casinos, more than $20 million in suspicious cash transactions. Following that peak, looking at the trend of suspicious cash transactions, it was about $5 million a month going through BC casinos. That's about $166,000 a day in suspicious cash transactions. So just by point of comparison, in February, the most recent month for which we have information following our reforms, $200,000 for the entire month. For the period between July 2015 and January, when we instituted those reforms, it was averaging about $5 million a month. So it's literally hundreds of millions of dollars have gone through BC casinos that are suspicious cash transactions. Not all of them necessarily involving the proceeds of crime, but certainly large-scale money laundering was taking place.
So a quick final question, thank you, is to what extent the federal government has been actually backing up and doing the enforcement that needs to be done. And I'm speaking specifically to Canada Revenue Agency and to the RCMP. Do they have the resources to do the enforcement? Have they been cooperative and as part of the plan that the new government has shown in British Columbia fighting back against money laundering? What are the recommendations you can give us specifically around those two agencies?
One of the recommendations we've received from Dr. German is increased resources for enforcement. The concern and the image I have in my mind of these FinTrack reports sitting around gathering dust is, I believe, a function of inadequate funding. I believe the province has some responsibility here, and I'm very hopeful that the federal government will also be good partners with us in ensuring that Revenue Canada and the RCMP have the resources necessary to investigate these reports when they're filed. One of the concerns that I have is that FinTrack may be concerned that they're filing reports with police agencies in British Columbia and not seeing a response. I would have no way of knowing, I don't believe our government would have any way of knowing if FinTrack was concerned that they were sending off reports to British Columbia and nothing was happening. And so that lack of a loop between the reports being filed by FINTRAC and the government knowing whether or not police have resources to respond is a very significant problem. And in terms of Revenue Canada, I can't speak to the number of investigations that Revenue Canada has instituted because of reports that they received from what was happening in BC casinos. I hope there were some, but I have no idea.
Thank you both. Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. It's not something I expected to be so blatant. I come from Northwest Territories, and we don't have any casinos, so this is new to me. And I'm trying to envision people walking in. But I've been to casinos across the country, so I know quite a bit about casinos. And normally, when you walk into a casino, there's security there, and if you got bags, they'll want to know what's in your bag. But to try and envision somebody walking in with suitcases full of $20 bills to the tune of $166,000 a day, that would have to be a lot of suitcases coming back and forth. So I'm going to assume, and maybe you could tell me if I'm right on this, but you're saying that the casinos are cooperating with the individuals that are bringing the bags. They're certainly not bringing it in the front door. They can't be, it can't be that blatant. I've never seen, although I don't spend that much time. But is that what you're saying, that there's arrangement for them to come in and exchange money?
Yeah. So the money was walking in the front door. That's the way that the money was coming into the casinos. It wasn't coming in armored cars or some sort of official channel. It was people with a shopping bag full of $20 bills who would walk it up to the cage. This is what was taking place in casinos. And the casinos, the service providers, in their defense, were doing everything that the provincial government asked them to do in terms of reporting, filling out forms, disclosing this. It's a human activity. There are problems with the reporting from time to time and so on. But the issue was not, in my opinion, with the reporting. The issue was, if you walk the money into the casino, then it appeared to be no problem. And there's a very interesting story that broke about a gentleman named Michael Mancini. The allegation that was made was that Mr. Mancini had in a newspaper article, was that Mr. Mancini had a significant amount of money in his car. The allegations that he was involved in a car accident. He was pulled over by police. They found a significant amount of money. He was on his way into the casino, and he was stopped by police, and they seized the money from him. He also allegedly had drugs in the car, and they seized the money from him. It feels to me like if you were able to get the money into the front doors of the casino, it was almost like getting it into the embassy, It was a whole different world than if you were driving down the street and a police officer stopped you and there was a duffel bag full of $20 bills in the back seat, that would have been seized. But if you were in the casino, it wasn't. And I don't know why that is. I don't know why it was treated so differently. It is, when I was briefed about it, just like you, it was beyond my comprehension that this had been taking place for so long and so openly.
And to try to zero on where some of the challenges are, so the casinos are reporting it, as you indicated, but their reports are they're not going anywhere. They're kind of sitting on the shelf. And so is that where the problem lies, is that there's not enough resources for FINTRAC, for others? You said you've not seen a whole lot of cooperation from RCMP, from Revenue Canada.
Thank you, member, for the question. The issue that I have is these are all black boxes to me. I don't know what's happening inside FINTRAC. I don't know what's happening inside Revenue Canada or within the RCMP, serious federal organized crime. I don't know what activity is taking place there. I'm hopeful that this committee will take this information I'm presenting to you, that the feeling on the ground in British Columbia is that things aren't happening. The reports are filed and things aren't happening. If you look into this and things are happening, then I'm very relieved by that. I'm not reassured that there have been so few money laundering charges or certainly tax evasion charges related to this. I don't know why that isn't happening in a more accelerated way. But in any event, I hope that you look into it and you can provide some assurance that there's a reason for the apparent lack of action. There may be a lot of action behind the scenes.
Okay, before I go to Mr. Albus, the minister has a flight at 6:10.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I've changed to the later flight, so we're all
Okay,
right.
you're okay?
Thank you.
All right. Okay, Mr. Albus, and then back to the side.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you, Minister, for your presence here. In regards to the to FinTrack directly, we have heard that the CRA does work with FinTrack to be able to, when cases are flagged. I do hope, though, that there is either ongoing investigations or, based on some of your comments today, that some of those files could be looked back to find out the frequent flyers, so to speak, when it comes to, actually, I'll rephrase that, the frequent filers, in large amounts could perhaps be looked into see with CRA whether there's tax evasion that's happening. Now, you've said about phase 2, it's to focus on real estate. Are you looking into the practice of builder's liens? I heard that is also a case where someone will buy a property, the builders will pave them for it, and then what they'll do is they'll fix it up, and that person will sell it as their principal residence so that there's no capital gains, etc. But what they'll do is they'll put builder's liens, and because the house was originally bought with money that may be laundered, that's how they're able to get the money laundered, is actually using something like a builder's lien to do that. So I really hope you look at that, because the touch points are all provincial. Furthermore, we had the lawyers, we had an individual come in last week, as well as the Association for Law Societies. And I did ask the question of where, a foreign subsidiary attempting to launder money into Canada or from a foreign jurisdiction will, come into an agreement with a host company with a backdoor agreement that they'll break an agreement, sue one another, and then the proceeds from then will then be cashed out because many foreign countries will have capital controls that will only allow money to flow if there is a court order. So have you heard of any of this kind of activity? It's so far the Law Society's, one of the representatives said it's theoretical, but have you heard of this technique, and do you think it needs to be looked at?
I thank the member for the question. There were two separate sets of allegations about the connection between the activity in our casinos and real estate. March 5th, 2018, the Globe and Mail, Kathy Tomlinson, wrote about allegations that 17 lenders with connections allegedly to crime loaned $47 million in builder's liens and other loans against 45 properties. And Post Media, Sam Cooper, September 30th, 2017, made a series of allegations about a gentleman named Paul Ginn and others, allegedly, who were involved in laundering money and transferring money in casinos, that Mr. Ginn allegedly was also heavily involved in real estate as well. Some of these were, as the member said, are builder's liens. Others appear to be just debt registered against the properties. As I say, these are good examples of us reading about this kind of thing in the newspaper. I've not heard about the specific situation, member, that you outlined there, but certainly there is no end to the creativity of the schemes that I have heard alleged. And the challenge, I think, for law enforcement on any of these files is the complexity of, first of all, determining the extent of the arrangement, and then the second piece, I understand, is proving that it's connected to an index offense that created the proceeds of crime in the first place. And so those two factors are quite difficult for law enforcement, as I understand it, and the situation that you describe incredibly difficult.
Well, I'm glad that all these things are on your radar, Minister, and because I think it is a problem that the public wants tackled. Just in regards to, again, we know that lawyers are not subject to FinTrack. You've raised that as being a concern in the recommendations. We heard from the law societies that say that every province does have a process for self-auditing and whatnot. There was the point, though, that there was not, in some cases, enough data forthcoming from those law societies to point out that the job is being done at a level that is at FinTrack level, or at least to that national standard. Now, that being said, we live in a federation. If a law society, let's say in British Columbia, was to not be forthcoming with data, would you look to put in place a framework that would secure that information to deal with this issue. Because I don't think, because of the Supreme Court decision, that a pan-Canadian approach is going to be applied. Perhaps that might be a way to deal with certain provinces where there is an issue of data. What are your thoughts?
So I've, just for clarity on the record, the recommendation comes from Dr. German about lawyers' trust accounts, and I look forward to reading his report about why he's identified this as an issue in British Columbia. I have raised this issue with the Law Society of British Columbia, and I've been advised that they are very engaged on this issue. And I'm sure they would be happy to provide information to the committee about the work that they're doing on this point. It is something that is raised repeatedly internationally, as well as in the media in British Columbia, especially in relation to the situation where you have a company with a lawyer as a sole director that owns property. And there's a lack of transparency around property ownership, for example. I think there is definitely opportunity for us to improve pieces around this. I look forward to working with our Law Society around that. If this committee has any concerns about lawyers and their involvement or alleged involvement in any kind of unsavory activity, lawyers do have an obligation not to be dupes of criminals and not to use their trust accounts for illegal purposes. I would be glad to have that information and raise it as in my role as a bencher of the Law Society. I don't have that information yet, but I'd be glad to hear from the committee any concerns that you have about that. I believe you'll find the Law Society of BC to be very forthcoming if you have concerns that you want to raise with them.
Okay, we'll have to end it there. We did have some of the federal organizations for lawyers the other day, and they are, I believe, quite engaged as well as trying to find an accommodation with this Supreme Court decision. Mr. Sabara?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Minister. Welcome, and thank you for coming out from BC. This week, the Hill Times has run a piece on money laundering, and obviously piggybacked off of our committee's work, and commend them for doing that, with the title, "The Fed's Float Idea of a Beneficial Ownership Registry as House Finance Committee Reviews Anti-Money Laundering Law." And as I was reading it over earlier this afternoon, you know, the RCMP estimated in 2009 that approximately $15 billion was being money laundered in Canada each year. And I don't know if that's an exact number, but it's a pretty big number. And it may speak to some of the things that you've seen in BC. Now, one of the things that a white paper that was issued by the Department of Finance just prior to our beginning of our study recommended is that, and I would like to hear your thoughts on this first idea, is that for the idea of expanding the types of entities who must report to FINTRAC to include mortgage insurers, land registry, and title insurance companies, non-federally regulated mortgage lenders, dealers in high-value goods, such as auction houses and jewelers, and unregulated financial companies. Care to comment on that?
Sure. I think that there's a great value in expanding the number of reporting agencies, but the problem is, from my perspective, that we're not doing the basics. So anytime someone can walk a duffel bag full of $20 bills into a casino and there's no apparent enforcement response, then I think that we've got some work to do on the basics. And the province has a responsibility there, and I accept that responsibility, and we will do work on that. And I hope that we have good partners in the federal government on that. I would love for us to be tracking people buying supercars with cash, $150,000 cars or more valuable that are walking cash into these car dealerships to require disclosure. I would also love for to have comfort that if a report was filled out that said, you know, this is a really suspicious transaction, I hope somebody looks at it, that would happen as well. So it's the two pieces. It's the reporting plus the enforcement.
And you did have mentioned in your testimony that you thought, you used the example of an individual working for FINTRAC in some warehouse and receiving a fax for something like that. It didn't seem to be very useful, or maybe not. It was missing some other measures, which is the enforcement. On the beneficial ownership registry, which in my view has become quite apparent that we need to do as a government, we need to do as a society. It seems, and I've always heard the stories that in BC and other jurisdictions that you'll have somebody purchase a house for $10, $15 million and it's owned by some corporation, but no one knows who is behind the corporation. How important is it that we get that information?
It is difficult for me to provide a national perspective for you. All I can do is really provide the British Columbia perspective for you. And housing is the #1 political issue in British Columbia. In the Lower Mainland, the issue is acutely connected to the fact that our real estate has been totally disconnected from what local wages can pay, and that nobody can convincingly answer the question of where the money is coming from. I think that as a matter of public confidence in government, we need to be able to answer the question of where the money in our housing market is coming from. And I think that's why you see me sitting here today, is because the people in British Columbia have clearly connected the issue of money laundering to impacts on their day-to-day life. It's about the 15-year-old in December who was driving with his parents who got hit by a stray bullet in Vancouver. It's about that gang crime. It's not a victimless crime, money laundering. It's also connected to the fact that we've got big problems in our real estate market. So I think it's critically important that we have beneficial ownership disclosure.
Mr. I applaud your efforts. I urge you to continue on. I think this is something that we need to battle. I think for the residents of the Lower Mainland, the housing issue, there's a disconnect. There are individuals, I've come to the conclusion that there is a lot of individuals moving money into Lower Mainland that you don't know. And it's funny because you can go buy a house in Ontario or wherever and you'll file your taxes every year, but the same individual that may not be a Canadian citizen, maybe just a permanent resident, may have just wanted to relocate here. No one will ask them, where did you get that money? We don't know. So they may have gotten offshore, they may have gotten off another entity. The reporting requirements must be strengthened. The enforcement mechanisms must be improved. I completely agree with you, and again, I applaud your efforts.
Okay, thank you, and we'll go to 2 more questioners, and then we'll go to our next panel, Mr. Albas, and back to Ms. O'Connell.
Yeah, thank you again, Mr. Chair and Mr. Minister, for being here. Now, there's been some discussion about mutual ownership, and I agree. There is a lot of, in the international community, going back, I think, to a meeting in the UK where David Cameron, the Prime Minister at the time, made transparency in some of these things one of the most important things to go ahead. So I appreciate your point. There is a lot of international pressure to see that, all jurisdictions, including provinces, territories, and the federal government up its game. Now, one of my first jobs was actually working at a law office where I used BC Online, the old system. It is a tremendously helpful system for land title, and it works quite well. Rather than looking at brand new registries, perhaps because right now people may not know that the federal government does have a registry for all federally regulated incorporated companies, and the same goes for every province and territory. Minister, do you think that there could be a way for us to look at including this information using existing registries? Or do you think that there must be a pan-Canadian one? I just think that there's, that may be a very difficult system to put in place. And what are your thoughts about that?
Thank you for that question. I'm not in any position to advise this committee on the best technical solution to requiring beneficial ownership disclosure, but I can tell you from someone in BC, you don't need a new federal system. We're going to put that information in our provincial systems. I think from my perspective, what would be fastest for BC is if the feds say, here are the standards that we're saying nationally we're going to try to hit around ensuring beneficial ownership is disclosed. Can you make sure that you have a registry in your province that discloses that information to the public? That's something that I think we can work with. I agree with the challenges and the potential delay inherent in establishing a federal registry for provincial companies or for provincial land title or so on. I think that a federal registry for federal companies would be a good thing, but I think we can do it in BC with our existing systems.
Utilizing existing systems, just adding greater accountability when it comes to finding those things out. Okay, no, I sincerely appreciate that. Now, you talked about luxury items, specifically cars. I would imagine that, boats may apply or whatnot, but what threshold do you think would be a good number to say? Because, you mentioned a $400,000 car. I don't think anyone in this room would say that is not a luxury vehicle. But what threshold do you think? Because ultimately FinTrack has to have a number.
The working definition for a supercar in British Columbia is $150,000 or more. There are a lot of pickup trucks, as I understand it, that can get up in the neighborhood of $100,000 that are common working trucks in British Columbia and especially in rural areas. And so again, I'm getting a little bit beyond my area of expertise. What could work, I think, for British Columbia is the existing standard of $10,000 in cash or more. But the question is, if a bunch of reports are generated as a result of that, does FinTrack have the capacity to manage that, and is somebody actually looking at the reports once they're generated?
Yeah, and I think most people would say $10,000 would be quite low. Most people, I would say, would probably think $50,000 or even $75,000 for a luxury car. Specifically, and we also got to bear in mind at this committee that the Income Tax Act gives special capital cost allowance or appreciation to luxury cars. When you sell them, you can dispose of them, and there's preferential treatment regarding depreciation. So I think the point should be made that if someone launders a car and then gets a tax break in some way, that might be odious to all of us here in regards to that. Now, Minister, lastly, in regards to, we've heard a number of comments, and again, going back to Law Society, that there sometimes seems to be an apprehension by authorities, and I mean both provincial police or RCMP, to pursue white-collar crime or money laundering because they're often complex cases. Now, have you changed any of the criteria to the Crown servants that ultimately make recommendations to what goes to, you see, in British Columbia, Mr. Chair, it's not the RCMP like in other jurisdictions that will see charges laid and then go to court. It's ultimately at the Crown. Have you encouraged the Crown to deal with cases where they're mortgage fraud, that has laundering components, or casino fraud, if there's charges, that they should really penalize these cases and prosecute them to send a message? Have you done that?
We have an independent Crown in British Columbia, the Criminal Justice Branch. I don't interfere in their daily prosecution decisions, but
you set policy,
absolutely.
correct?
We set policy, and also we set resources. And I'm in conversations with our Crown to ensure that they have the resources, because some of these cases are, as you say, incredibly complex, that they can dedicate Crown time to that, to assist police in ensuring, as is appropriate, in ensuring that police are doing the investigation in a way that, within their separate spheres of authority, that they have access to Crown resources when they need them, and that also that Crown are available to assist with disclosure obligations to defense counsel, so that we don't run into a Jordan situation.
But you haven't resourced them, and you haven't changed the policy
Dan, we
yet.
got
Is
to
that
end
correct?
it there.
No.
We'll have to end it there, guys. Last question in this block.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. I just want to, actually, one of the areas you touched on is something I had asked several questions on, especially to FinTrack, in terms of the accountability around if they put together a report and send it to the police or to investigations. I don't think even FinTrack knows if it's then taken on. It sounds like, based on earlier testimony, that FinTrack believes it has the resources to handle the claims or the issues coming in. But one of the areas I was curious about, so I appreciate your testimony, is how does anybody know? I mean, even if CSIS were to provide FinTrack with some information that then they put into a report and then maybe passed it on, how do we know if anybody is really actually acting on that once FinTrack makes the report? So with that being said, one of the areas that was raised in testimony were the Federal Committee on Public Safety, and there might be oversight opportunities there. I can't prejudge what the recommendations from this committee would be, or even what the government's actions would be, but what would be the role then for provincial and territorial governments? Because you mentioned, the frustration that you have no idea, even if your police that you would be responsible for are acting on this. How do you see, or have you given any thought to a potential role for that oversight, keeping in mind that if, for example, a committee might be given that oversight role in the future, and if you haven't given that thought, that's totally fine. It's just I'm kind of wrestling with how do we deal with it from the national perspective, but also keeping in mind police forces obviously will fall under provincial territorial jurisdiction in some instances. So how do we work together, or do you have any thoughts on working together on how to close that gap?
I think that is a really important question to raise with FINTRAC and with police services. It would be one of the things that I can imagine is that police would report back, that FINTRAC would ask, have you taken action on a file? And the police would report back, yes, we've taken, or our Revenue Canada would report back, yes, we've taken action. What would be useful for us to know is how do we compare with other provinces? If the police are taking action on 10% of files in British Columbia, is that similar in other jurisdictions, or 90%? Is that similar in other jurisdictions? And FINTRAC is in a unique position to advise us on the response they're receiving in BC or from specific police agencies than others. Is there a police agency? We have we have municipal forces as well as RCMP. Are there some that provide better responses than others? FINTRAC, again, in a unique position to advise us, but as far as I can tell, they can't or don't. And so whether or not FINTRAC has adequate resources for the job they've been asked to take on also is, I think, a question for FINTRAC. But I do think that there is probably a way for us to know generally high level about the responses they're receiving from law enforcement.
Thank you.
And sorry. And just in closing, I note that we have a number of provincial recommendations about everything from policing to Crown to others that are coming to us from Peter German, and I encourage the committee, because this issue may also be dealt with, to get your hands on that report once it's publicly released as well.
Thank you. So just to clarify, based on the testimony we've had and the backgrounders from FINTRAC, their role is simply reporting. So that asking that follow-up question is the suggestion that I would probably take from your testimony is then to expand FINTRAC's mandate to have some level of feedback then on the reverse. So I don't think, in fairness, that they're collecting this data or this information, just aren't providing it. I think as it stands right now, their mandate doesn't provide to collect that information. So perhaps this is an area that, based on what you're saying, just to have that reporting back to the various governments through FINTRAC would help. So then you can take that back within your mandate.
I would be very concerned if it was a one-way channel of communication, just FINTRAC broadcasting with no feedback coming back from law enforcement. If that's the case and your committee has uncovered that, I think that's a serious problem.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, you got time for a very short one.
I guess in terms of the casinos, I think my colleague mentioned in terms of just having the cash brought in, and as well as this idea that if it was anywhere else, anyone walking around with that much cash, it would be treated differently. Is there some federal regulation or gap in the legislation specifically around casinos that we should look at?
I think that the challenge, if there is one other than the just sheer number of bodies around enforcement, is the requirement for proving the index offense in order to sustain a money laundering charge. Someone who walks in a duffel bag full of 20s that is unable to explain where the money came from or refuses to do so, I don't know. I would hope that the committee would be looking at what tools might be available to address that kind of situation, because that's the kind of situation we faced in British Columbia.
Okay. With that, thank you very much, Mr. Minister, and
thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the committee members for your thoughtful questions. I really appreciated it.
Good luck catching your flight.
Thank you.
Okay, we will suspend for a couple of minutes, and the other witnesses, please come to the table. And if you have to catch a flight, the second-tier witnesses, let us know, and we'll try and deal with you more quickly. So we'll suspend for 3 minutes. Convene, and my apologies for the votes, which is running as a half an hour behind. We'll start with the Blockchain Association of Canada. Mr. Kemper, Executive Director, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's finish this cookie. I didn't know I was going to be up first. So I'll read this prepared statement. The Blockchain Association of Canada welcomes the opportunity. I know it just died. Welcomes the opportunity to present today and share our perspectives. The Blockchain Association of Canada's mission is to promote the acceptance and use of digital assets and blockchain-based technologies, and we are supported by a diverse community that represents the industry both in Canada and globally. Through education, advocacy, and coordination with policymakers, regulatory agencies, and industry across various jurisdictions, our goal is to develop a pro-growth legal environment that fosters innovation, job creation, and investment. We represent a community of the world's leading innovators, operators, and investors in the digital asset and blockchain technology ecosystem, including leading-edge startups, software companies, global IT consultancies, financial institutions, insurance companies, law firms, and investment firms. The BAC understands that while many new financial technologies, fintechs, are emerging, blockchain and other distributed ledger technologies, DLT, impact governments and regulators throughout the globe. DLT applications offer a wide variety of practical and readily applicable opportunities for many industries. The BAC supports legal and regulatory clarity around DLT and related smart contract technologies. Defined contours are needed to combat regulatory overreach, which is a potential issue for DLT in many jurisdictions at this time. Onerous regulatory requirements present obstacles to industry growth as DLT solutions develop and seek to enter the marketplace. A significant impediment to the fintech industry is the risk of burdensome regulations being imposed too early, which would hinder future innovation, discourage further investment in innovation, and/or restrict the utilization and incorporation of DLT into the financial services and other industries. DLT raises many novel legal issues for lawmakers and regulators. For example, decentralized technologies may operate based on automated protocols and lack a centralized governor. These issues must be carefully studied before imposing rules that may not be well suited for their intended purpose. Lawmakers and regulators must not act too quickly by imposing regulations that risk hindering the efficiencies and promise that such technologies may deliver. The BAC generally encourages regulators and governments to adopt a do-no-harm approach to regulation to allow DLT to develop and companies to innovate within a principles-based rather than prescriptive environment. The BAC encourages the government and regulators to facilitate the development and implementation of fintech and specifically DLT by supporting regulatory harmony. Consistency in regulatory treatment will be an important factor towards industry growth. The Blockchain Association of Canada supports regulatory regimes only to the extent such obligations clarify the regulatory environment and do not pose additional or overlapping burdens and potential regulatory conflicts. The potential for multiple oversight authorities to certify and impose requirements on this emerging technology may hinder the development of the industry and the evolution of the technologies both in Canada and abroad. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kemper. Turning to the Canadian Real Estate Association, Ms. McNeil, Director, and Mr. Parham, Legal Counsel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Dina McNeil, Director of Government Relations at the Canadian Real Estate Association, or CREA. I'm joined today by Simon Parham, one of CREA's in-house legal counsel. We would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to participate in the 5-year review of the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act. Nos membres comptent plus de 125,000 courtiers et agents immobiliers.
Our members include more than 125,000 brokers and real estate agents throughout the country. We are one of the single industry associations, most important single industry associations in Canada, and we work on behalf of our members as well as house buyers and the general public.
We understand why investors from around the world would be drawn to investing in the real estate market in Canada. We recognize that CREA and its members have a role to play in Canada's money laundering and terrorist financing regime. We continue to work with FINTRAC to improve guidance and create conditions conducive to realtors complying with the existing obligations. We communicate regularly with our members on the importance of complying with the law. We do this by delivering in-person or online presentations across the country, also by sharing comprehensive, updated information through articles, blogs, monthly newsletters, and email communications. CREA also provides valuable tools such as FAQs and template compliance manuals and forms to facilitate record keeping and help with reporting obligations for our members. Most importantly, realtors and their brokerage offices from across this country do their part by trying their best to comply with Canada's money laundering and terrorist financing regime. They maintain complex, detailed compliance regimes and conduct a myriad of regulatory paperwork that FINTRAC requires, but ultimately that never sees the light of day. That said, we do have concerns with the law and the application of the law as it stands today. As this committee has heard from other witnesses, money laundering and terrorist financing activities are highly intricate, complex, and are often difficult to recognize and detect. Many different actors and parties are involved in real estate transactions, and we believe they should all have a role to play in combating money laundering and terrorist financing. However, we are concerned with the reporting and record-keeping obligations, which cause a significant burden on realtors. It is not just a matter of reporting suspicious transactions to FINTRAC. Members have to keep various records and create a detailed compliance regime. This involves identifying a compliance officer, developing and maintaining compliance policies and procedures, conducting risk assessments of business activities and relationships, creating and maintaining a written ongoing compliance training program, and conducting an effectiveness review to test the compliance of the program every 2 years. The regulatory burden is significant, and many brokers and agents try their best, but are frustrated, confused, and at a loss on how to keep up with the overwhelming requirements. We feel insufficient attention is paid to the regulatory burden and compliance costs. Many realtors operate small businesses and have minimal expertise in analyzing money laundering indicators. Additionally, changes to the regulations and guidance are frequent and at times unclear, which makes it difficult for small business owners to keep up. We feel that implementing new requirements around beneficial ownership and politically exposed persons would cause significant frustration and increase the cost of compliance drastically. CREA would like to see a stable legislative and regulatory environment.
Get you to slow down just a little bit.
Can't keep up. CREA would like to see a stable legislative and regulatory environment, giving realtors an opportunity to fully understand and comply with the existing obligations without continuously having to adjust. Closing existing loopholes for the real estate should be a focus for the government. We are encouraged that the white paper released by the Department of Finance presents the idea of expanding the types of reporting entities who must report to FINTRAC. This would create a more level playing field for real estate. Yet, an obvious gap in the law continues to be ignored. Currently, real estate can be sold directly by individuals, which creates a vulnerability where money launderers can conduct real estate transactions without the transparency and examination required when using a realtor. CREA feels that reporting and record-keeping obligations should be extended to the companies who facilitate such transactions. While the government is considering extending obligations to other reporting entities, we feel it would be wise to include the for sale by owners companies. If obligations continue to evolve, education and ongoing outreach efforts are essential for new and existing realtors to make sure they understand their requirements. We ask that FINTRAC put in place a better outreach strategy to build strong partnerships with reporting entities to maximize compliance. It would also be helpful to clarify existing guidance in a manner that is meaningful to brokers and agents and adopt policy interpretations that make sense. FINTRAC has the responsibility to try harder to understand that all reporting entities are not the same. A one-size-fits-all model should not be applied across the board. Moreover, when reporting entities ask for policy interpretations and clarifications, responding to the entity's concerns in a timely manner is critical. We feel greater outreach would have an improved impact in fighting money laundering and terrorist financing for the real estate sector. We look forward to the committee's report and continuing to help improve the proceeds of crime, money laundering, and terrorist financing regime. Merci de votre temps. Simon et moi serons fiers de répondre aux questions des membres du comité.
For your time, we will be pleased to answer your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Turning to the Investment Industry Association of Canada, Mr. Russell, President and CEO. Welcome, Ian.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur le Président et membres.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. As mentioned, my name is Ian Russell, and I'm President and CEO of the Investment Industry Association of Canada. Thank you for the invitation to come before this standing committee to present the views of the IIAC
on your 5-year statutory review of the Proceeds of Crime and Terrorist Financing Act. As some of you know, the IIAC is the national association representing 123 investment dealers on securities regulation and public policy. Dealers have important obligations as reporting entities under the Act and its regulations, similar to the other regulated financial intermediaries in Canada. Our members follow an extensive and onerous process to verify client identity and ensure they do not represent unacceptable financial crime risk. They're also required to have in place real-time risk mitigation measures to prevent suspicious transactions, and due diligence processes, especially in dealing with politically exposed persons. We keep detailed records and we submit mandatory reports on suspicious transactions to FINTRAC and are subject to an audit process by FINTRAC and other regulatory authorities in Canada. We've reviewed the Department of Finance discussion paper, and our perspective is really framed through that consultation paper that proposes measures both to improve the effectiveness of the legislation and also facilitate the obligations and responsibilities of reporting entities. And we applaud the consensus first off, we applaud the consensus reached by the federal and provincial and territorial finance ministers last December to improve the transparency and consistency of beneficial ownership information and access to the information. Although corporate information reporting requirements are in place in both the federal and provincial levels, there are differences that pertain to the definition, collection, disclosure, and access to the information. And in our view, governments really need to move expeditiously to harmonize beneficial ownership standards across Canada and in the both federal and provincial corporate law statutes. And they really need to look carefully at mechanisms to improve access to this information. We believe this committee could play a significant role in encouraging federal and provincial governments to give a high priority to creating a central registry that can contain current and accurate information related to beneficial ownership. And as was cited here in earlier testimony, the example that stands in front of us is the UK People with Significant Control Register. A central register will, from your perspective, achieve, I think, a more efficient and accurate transactional surveillance process for the marketplace. Finance ministers have committed to changes that will make information on beneficial ownership available to law enforcement, tax, and other authorities, and we think that it should be extended, as in the UK model, to be accessible to certainly all reporting entities and possibly to the general public to meet public policy objectives. The central registry, as I said, would be of enormous benefit to securities dealers who find it a very complicated and time-consuming process to work through the complexity of business structures, in particular private corporations. Our other recommendations relate to facilitating the obligations of securities dealers and other reporting agencies to improve entities to improve the efficiency of the reporting exercise and also to relieve the compliance burden. One, the legislation should be flexible to accommodate new technologies such as digital identification in the verification process, and it should be sufficiently flexible to enable the timely adaptation of a range of innovative technology, facial recognition as a case in point. Second, FINTRAC should engage in ongoing dialogue with securities dealers and other reporting entities to ensure the greater transparency on FINTRAC requirements. For example, when reporting entities such as securities dealers send suspicious transaction reports to FINTRAC, we believe that FINTRAC should provide timely feedback to reporting entities indicating which STRs happen to be suspicious or not. And in our view, that kind of a interactive process would certainly be helpful to the reporting entities that are trying to track these transactional flows by particular counterparties. Third, it's important in our view that there's interactive communication between FINTRAC and the other regulators. Regulators such as the self-regulatory bodies of which securities dealers are responsible to also have money laundering regulations, and it certainly would be helpful if we could have a congruence or a process that can ensure there isn't the duplication in the rulemaking process, and that would come about by close coordination between FINTRAC and the regulators. And finally, the other recommendation is in subsection 6.2 of the Act. It provides certain exemptions from the record-keeping requirements and verification requirements for reporting entities. And I have in mind here in particular listed corporations in Canada and regulated financial institutions in Canada. And in our view, there is scope to expand these exemptions to certain foreign regulated entities that are subject to a comparable regulatory regime as in Canada. I'm thinking in particular of hedge funds, asset managers of all sorts in regimes such as the United Kingdom, where they are regulated, or in the United States under the SEC, or in the former case under the FCA in the UK. And again, the advantage of that, it would relieve the reporting entities of an identification burden that you could justify in terms of this mutual recognition process. And my understanding, this is a recommendation we put forward a number of times in the past to finance. I think the pushback is creating precedents among some of these foreign jurisdictions. But in our view, you can start with the US and the UK, you can include the G7, but certainly most of the transactional flows internationally from their institutional flows are coming from the UK and the US. And the other reason why it's important, aside from eliminating the compliance burden, is that these requirements can discourage these regulated financial institutions from actually transacting with dealers in the Canadian market in Canadian securities, and certainly that's not in our public benefit. So we think that the protections are there from a money laundering point of view and also from investor protection if there is a careful recognition process that is in place. So with that, I'll close my remarks, and I'm happy to answer any questions on this subject matter or anything else related to the Act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Turning then to the Transparency International Canada, Mr. Mooney.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Je vous remercie de cette occasion de
Thank you for this opportunity to participate in your deliberations. I will speak in English, and I will be pleased to answer your questions in either French or English.
Beneficial ownership and anti-money laundering with Transparency International Canada. I'm also a former Deputy Director of FINTRAC and former Director General with the CRA's Criminal Investigation Directorate. Transparency International Canada is a member of the world's leading non-governmental anti-corruption organization with more than 100 chapters worldwide and an international secretariat in Berlin. TI Canada has been at the forefront of our national anti-corruption and transparency agenda. TI Canada welcomes the review of the PCML-TFA. We recognize and support the work played by all the anti-money laundering, anti-terrorism financing partners in Canada, and the critical role that reporting entities play as a first line of defense in this fight. We will be providing this committee and the Department of Finance a more comprehensive submission on our recommendations As we don't have much time, I'd like to move directly to TI Canada's 5 key recommendations. First, TI Canada recommends implementation of a nationally integrated, publicly accessible beneficial ownership registry of corporations in an open data format. The registry would be a one-stop shop with registrars or a registrar having appropriate powers to apply proportionate and dissuasive sanctions when information is untruthful. And the Act should be amended to require all reporting entities, including what is called the DNFBPs, basically the ones that are not financial entities or financial institutions, such as real estate, who are now exempt from the obligation of identifying beneficial ownership. So the law should require them to determine and verify the identity of the beneficial owner, to determine if their customers are politically exposed persons, their family members or associates, and they should not open accounts or complete financial transactions until the beneficial owner has been identified and their identity verified with government-approved ID. Of course, this recommendation will be facilitated by the implementation of a publicly accessible beneficial ownership registry. Canada needs to make beneficial ownership transparent. In Canada, more rigorous identity checks are done for individuals getting library cards than for those setting up companies. We need a proactive corporate registry function, harmonized and integrated across Canada with powers to audit, compel information, apply sanctions, detect and report suspicious activities. Pending final legislative approvals, all 28 European Union member states are expected to implement a public registry by the end of 2019. A majority of the 37 FATF members, which is the international standard setting body on money laundering, are expected to implement a publicly accessible beneficial ownership registry. It's not a stretch to anticipate that such a public registry will be the new FATF standard in a few years. That's the standard Canada should meet. We welcome the positive steps that finance ministers announced on December 11, 2017 to ensure appropriate authorities know who runs which corporations in Canada. However, we believe they must go further. They must make the registry publicly accessible and look to also create a registry of trusts. A public registry will allow all reporting entities, the public and the media, to work together to prevent and dissuade the abuse of corporations and trusts by secretive beneficial owners. This will lighten the burden on reporting entities and anyone doing business with corporations to more accurately assess their business risks. A publicly accessible registry is an investment in prevention. Will also ensure Canada keeps up with international best practices, such as those adopted by the UK and our new EU free trade partners. Second, Canada's 2015 risk assessment was clear. Legal professionals are inherently highly vulnerable to money laundering. The FATF evaluation of Canada also highlighted the gap created by the absence of lawyers from the AML-ATF regime and the lack of scope in their own regime. Without an independent expert assessment, Canadians have little information to be assured that the legal profession's rules and practices meet the current Canadian standards set by the Act or even the FATF standards in protecting against money laundering and terrorist financing. We recommend that the government bring legal professionals into the AML-ATF regime in a constitutionally compliant way. The Solicitors Regulation Authority that regulates solicitors in England and Wales is a model that the Federation of Law Societies of Canada and the government should seriously explore. We also recommend that the Act should designate as high risk all financial transactions by legal professionals, especially those using trust accounts, and require reporting entities to take enhanced due diligence measures on those transactions, including determining the beneficial owner and the source of funds. Third, we recommend strengthening the regime by expanding the number of DNFBPs covered under the Act, as per the Department of Finance's recent consultation paper, especially for non-federally regulated mortgage lenders because of the high vulnerability of real estate to money laundering. We understand from law enforcement that money laundering charges by prosecutors are abandoned because of the complexity of linking money laundering to the predicate offense. The government should consider recklessness or gross negligence as a standard of proof. This leads us to our fourth recommendation, that the government bring criminal code amendments to make money laundering easier to investigate and prove, and that resources for police and prosecutors should be re-examined to better support enforcement. Otherwise, laws without adequate enforcement are meaningless. Concluding with our fifth recommendation, Mr. Chairman, we recommend that comprehensive annual reports be published by the Government of Canada with the collaboration of all provinces and territories on the AML-ATF's regime's results for all Canadian jurisdictions, including the number of compliance violations, penalties issued, money laundering investigations, charges laid, prosecutions, convictions, forfeitures and seizures, as well as activities by the Canada Border Services Agency that are related to the Act. We believe that more information and transparency should be available publicly on the results of the AML-ATF regime. Thank you for your time you have offered us to speak today. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much for that extensive brief. And as an individual, Mr. Jeremy Clark, Concordia University. Jeremy, you're the last one on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm Jeremy Clark. I'm an assistant professor at the Concordia Institute for Information Systems Engineering in Montreal at Concordia University. I received my PhD in 2011 from the University of Waterloo, and it was around that time that I first became interested in Bitcoin, so about 8 years ago. Bitcoin is an emerging digital currency that uses cryptography in a novel way to provide a secure cash-like system for creating new money, enabling transactions between participants, and recording transactions in a decentralized way on a ledger that we now call the blockchain. Now, given my expertise as an engineer or a technologist, I feel I can best assist you by providing the technical details of how Bitcoin and blockchain technologies work. I have had many conversations with regulators at FINTRAC, as well as Bank of Canada, the AMF in Quebec, Department of Finance, CRTC, the RCMP, and others. So I could maybe play a policy expert on TV, but I'll stick to the technology for the purposes of today. I continue to maintain that successful regulation in these areas requires an accurate understanding of the technology. So cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, are decentralized. What does that mean? It means that they're operated by a network of computers. Anyone can join or leave at any time from anywhere in the world with no one company or server in charge. Transactions are deemed valid or invalid through the consensus of this network. For the best cryptocurrencies, transactions clear and settle on the order of seconds and can be conducted 24/7 with email-like efficiency. I want to emphasize that after the transaction is confirmed by the network, the unit value has actually moved. It's not like a digital authorization and then there's some actual settlement that happens behind the scenes. Once it's confirmed, the unit of value is actually settled and cleared. Now, if you hold Bitcoin, what does that actually mean? What is a Bitcoin? Where is it? So it simply means that there's an entry on Bitcoin's ledger for you and a balance that can go up or down. It's basically intangible beyond that. One parallel that you might think about are cell phone minutes. What's a cell phone minute? Why do you have it? What exactly is it? It's basically just a ledger entry. And cell phone minutes have coincidentally been used as a makeshift currency in countries like Kenya. Anonymity is often ascribed to cryptocurrencies, but the level of anonymity varies. For Bitcoin, all transactions are recorded, but without real-world identities. Other cryptocurrencies might obfuscate identities further and/or hide transactional amounts. In all cases, transactions are internet packets that originate from a computer and are no different than other forms of online communication that might be of interest to regulators or law enforcement. Cryptocurrencies have been suggested as being perfect for various financial crimes, such as tax evasion, terrorist financing, and currency smuggling. Governments have primarily looked at the quote-unquote on-ramps and off-ramps between cryptocurrencies and, say, the Canadian dollar. I think this is sensible in the short run. There's also concern about the use of cryptocurrencies on online markets for illicit goods. Law enforcement has a very good track record of shutting these markets down, essentially by framing the issue as tracing internet packets rather than focusing on the currency that is being used. If we can zoom out for a second, we can take one of two postures in dealing with illicit cryptocurrency activity. We could try and take a stance of prevention or one of detection. I think prevention will fail. Cryptocurrencies are open, it's an internet-driven technology, and Bitcoin is just the first attempt at strong confidentiality and anonymity. It would honestly be technically easier and maybe more productive to ban paper money than Bitcoin. Instead, we should focus on detection of criminal activities. Finally, inside of Bitcoin, underlying it, is a novel technical innovation called the blockchain. We've seen blockchain projects from within the government, for example, Bank of Canada and the National Research Council. And this technology has the potential to bring changes to accounting practices, transparency to procurement processes, new methods for raising capital within a company, and new ways of organizing financial markets. We're hopeful that blockchain technology generally adds transparency and accountability to the financial system. I've tried to keep my remarks concise and brief. I once taught an entire course on Bitcoin, so I can literally talk about it for 24 hours. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
You might have to talk to us for 24 hours on it. Joel, the briefing was supposed to start at 6:30. That's delayed till we're done as a committee on the BIA?
It's going to start at 6:30, Mr. Chair.
Pardon?
It's starting at 6:30.
Okay, that's a real problem for some of our members. I can see this been a problem. Because if anybody should be there, it should be Finance Committee members. I guess there's nothing we can do about it, but I certainly think the department should take it into consideration that committee members on the Finance Committee need to be there for the briefing on the Budget Implementation Act. I don't know what we can do about it at this stage, but Dan.
I just would like to just register my disappointment that, again, 11:15 this morning, around that time, we got notice that there was going to be a technical briefing. And again, given the previous Parliament, there was at least a weekend so that people knew. So just, again, I'm not going to be hard on the Parliamentary Secretary because obviously it's not up to him to win the tabling and when the technical briefing is made available. That's something I would hope, though, that he would take back to his minister in office. So.
Yeah, I think we got to. There really does. Just as chair, that I do think when we get a document this thick, we do need a day before we go to a briefing from departmental officials. Anyway, we'll leave it alone for now. It's something we'll have to sort out for the next one for sure. And no fault of yours, Joel, but. It is a problem because we've witnesses here. We can't, they've come to town. We can't ignore them either. Mr. Julian.
Well, Mr. Chair, it could be postponed. That briefing was scheduled last minute. It's, I don't think, showing respect to members of Parliament. The Parliamentary Secretary does have the ability to postpone it till tomorrow night, which I think would make a lot more sense.
Now, Mr. Chair, out of respect for all the officials who are there tonight and the other parliamentarians who intend to attend, we'll proceed with the briefing. However, for the parts that the members of the committee might miss, we'll see what we can do to offer perhaps another briefing for the parts that were missed because of the committee.
Okay, yeah, I just noticed it on my BlackBerry now, so that's why I asked you. Why I asked you the question. Okay, then we'll leave it at that. But certainly, I think, and I don't think any members should be offside on this. That for a briefing on a Budget Implementation Act, we really need a day to see it before we have a briefing and have the opportunity to go. All right. With that, we'll start with questions, and we have about an hour. Ms. O'Connell, we'll go to 5-minute rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here and for your testimony. I'm going to start with Mr. Kemper. You talked about basically, if I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but in terms of regulations not going too fast to basically suffocate the development and the technology from somewhat being developed and moving forward, which I can certainly understand. And to Mr. Clark's testimony too, the opportunities for blockchain technology are certainly interesting, and I think from governments to private sector, everyone's very interested in what this can mean. So my specific question is around the type of regulation that maybe other governments or places around the world that you think is too far, too fast, notwithstanding Bitcoin, because I think there are other issues there, but in terms of blockchain technology, do you have specific examples where you're concerned about regulations that will stifle the development?
Thank you for that good question. One of the challenges with kind of managing innovation is understanding that the effects that we can make in these rooms can have enormous consequences for the industry at large. Before we can go and make these regulations, it's really important that we understand the technology and the scope of this, the opportunities it presents. Blockchain technology is a paradigm-shifting technology. It is like the internet. It is like the automobile. It stands to change the very fabric of society. We are around here, like, have been discussing the rules and the regulations and looking at it like, you know, from a wax and wick point of view. And now we have electricity. We need to be building sockets to encourage and utilize the benefits of this technology. Listening to my fellow panelists here, an open corporate registry, absolutely. Blockchain can solve this perfectly. As far as real estate goes, putting real estate titles onto a blockchain, absolutely. As far as FinTrack and compliance goes, having proof that all of those records are submitted and verifiability about them, excellent, excellent, excellent. The scope of the opportunities are just incredible. From an investment point of view, being able to track that, thinking about when we register a corporation as opposed to just assigning a number that says 100,000 shares to you and 100,000 shares to you, actually utilizing tokens tied to digital identities, tied to permissions, about whether you can vote, about who's the officer, who's the secretary, who's the legal counsel, do you have access to a building? It all kind of comes full circle. So in terms of where are some, like, you know, regulations that are kind of hindering it, well, I think that anybody who's like, you know, speaking very negatives about it, or, like, you know, potentially banning the cryptocurrency. We saw that with New York as one example with their BitLicense agenda to try and have anybody who is developing solutions around Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies to require state approval. It actually pushed a lot of the businesses away. So if we think about it like the internet, and if we require people to get licenses to open websites, people are just going to open websites in other countries. They're going to move away to jurisdictions that are more friendly, and understanding also that we're in a time of convergence where we have technologies like artificial intelligence, robotics, automation, all coming together as one as well, and that in order to register your company, you're going to be looking for the best conditions in order to do that. So it's our duty.
I don't mean to get you off, but I only have 5 minutes. So, but I appreciate the idea there. Mr. Clark, again, following on a similar line of questioning. So I guess, Mr. Kemper, I don't disagree actually at the potential and the technology potential of blockchain. But I think what governments and regulators around the world are going to have to deal with are the, you know, the separation or the issues around cryptocurrencies. So from a blockchain technology point, and I understand fully that, you know, the technology comes from the cryptocurrency, I get it. But from a regulator moving forward, and the risks for money laundering, terrorism financing, on the cryptocurrency side. So with that being said, how do we not stifle the technology development while maintaining the very real issues? And even if you don't want to get into the issues of you know, terrorism financing and money laundering, just look at around the world what we're seeing now in the sale of the currencies and the illicit you know, sales that are going on there, and people having all their money taken because they're not legitimate cryptocurrency organizations. So how do we as regulators then kind of round this issue?
Sure. So once again, I'm more on the technology side than the policy side, but I'll try and answer as best as I can. In terms of different countries have taken different approaches to regulating cryptocurrencies, I don't have a shining example of a country that did it wrong. There was a lot of criticism of something called the BIT license in the New York State. So that seemed to be felt by the community to be a regulatory overreach. In Canada, most Bitcoin people or cryptocurrency or blockchain people are fairly happy with the current state where exchanges are sort of operating as money service businesses. They're doing financial reporting. There are some concerns about banks, commercial banks, shutting down the bank accounts of businesses that operate with Bitcoin. So that's maybe one criticism that I've heard. But yeah, sometimes regulation also can sort of pave a way to say that we like this technology. And so sometimes remaining silent on certain issues as well can be a detriment. I know one bureaucrat that I won't name, but he basically was shopping around a blockchain project and he said, I stopped asking whether we can do this and I started asking, do you know of a specific rule that you can point to that you know would get broken if we try and do this? And so that was sort of their approach for trying to make these blockchain projects work within government policy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. I'll start with Ms. McNeil. I was involved for many years in the mortgage industry, and including being its industry representative on the Real Estate Council of Alberta. And many of the things that you had said struck me as quite familiar. It sounded to me like you were conveying a sense that the honest practitioner at times finds the compliance with regulation to be onerous, leading to a situation where the people that know the rules the best are the criminals who then have the knowledge to circumvent or to find the end runs around regulation. Is that similar to the experience that expressed by your members?
Do you want to take this?
Sure. So thank you for the question. On the first comment that you made, that some of our members, honest, well-meaning members, find this onerous, that is certainly correct. I brought this little brick here as an example of, this is 555 pages of guidance and regulation and the Act itself that a brokerage would have to read in order to fully comply with the legislation. This does not include the 1,207 pages of FINTRAC policy interpretations which they have issued, not all of which apply to the real estate sector, but they would still have to read through them, as well as FINTRAC advisories. So there's a lot.
Are there any particular irritants that your members talk to you about?
It does vary, actually. The difficulty we have is we do hear anecdotal stories, and I'll give you one example. Is we recently heard a situation where a member had an examination, a FINTRAC examination in British Columbia, and they were cited, and we don't know the full details. We talked to the member, and they were cited for writing Vancouver, BC on their identification form as opposed to Vancouver, British Columbia. So that kind of nitpicky distraction frustrates our members and sometimes takes the eye off the ball of what is actually supposed to be accomplished here, which is detecting money laundering. So that's an anecdotal observation. The difficulty is we don't have any aggregate statistics from FINTRAC about where members are having difficulties, and that's the kind of information we could use. We've asked them many times, actually.
With compliance.
Exactly. We've asked them many times, how can we help you? Show us over time where members are struggling, and we can use our resources. You can leverage us to help communicate that to our members. And they've given us snapshots and said, well, we heard this story out in BC, and here's something from Toronto, but they do not provide us with any information, as far as we can tell they don't have it, of where there are trends over time of where there's problems. For example, maybe there's bigger problems in BC than Ontario. We just don't know. So we hear a lot of stories, but at the end of the day, they're anecdotal stories. They would be much better if we had a complete picture from them.
Okay. Mr. Munier, if I may, I'm looking at the preamble to your fourth recommendation. The concern from law enforcement that money laundering charges are abandoned over the complexity. What about even just getting to the investigation stage? I mean, I repeatedly heard in my career about just a reluctance to prosecute fraud at all, and money laundering and terrorist finance are particular types of fraud. Has that been your experience both in your time previous when you were with FinTrack and with the CRA?
I'd have to say that certainly the best people to comment on that would be people from law enforcement, active members. Just in my own experience in the past, I've had opportunities to speak with Crown prosecutors in a few provinces at the federal level as well, and they're swamped. To be fair, I believe FinTrack probably has produced probably close to 2,000 disclosures, money laundering and terrorist financing to the police. So it's like drinking from a fire hose if you're in the police investigation business. So that's an issue. There are not 2,000 money laundering investigations ongoing in Canada every day. There are choices being made by investigators and by prosecutors. And the information I had at the time when I was there was that the prosecutors, because of the complexity to tie it to the predicate offense, they'd be trading it off. Plead guilty to this and we'll drop it, and they would get an agreement with the defense.
If the predicate offense isn't even investigated, though, I mean, often yes, there has to be a predicate.
We're over your time. We'll probably come back. But I do want to say to witnesses is if you have a supplementary point you want to raise when a question is directed at somebody else, don't be afraid to raise your hand and we'll try and let you in. Mr. Julian.
Thank you very much to all the witnesses. Very interesting, a very compelling testimony. Ms. McNeil, you talked about closing loopholes, and I think most Canadians would be very surprised to learn that owner-sale real estate isn't subject to the same system of checks and balances that happens when a realtor is involved. Do you have any idea in terms of the percentage of sales across the country that are owner sales? I certainly see them advertised more and more on television, but to what extent are we actually excluding from the real estate, the system of controls, portions of real estate sales in this country?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have data on the sales that exclude realtors. We don't know how many transactions we complete or members complete. But unfortunately, from either mirror posters or for sale by owners, FSBOs, we don't have any data on that. We know in certain provinces it's definitely higher than others, but we don't have numbers.
Would you even hazard a guess? Is it 5% of the market to 20% of the market?
I think in Quebec it's more like 20% of the market, and we know that province is higher. But other provinces, I would guess less than 20%, but we can't say for sure.
So it's certainly significant. And what you're saying is that if there's a system of checks and balances for those transactions involving a realtor, that needs to be extended to that sector as well.
To the companies, yes. Right? Not to the individual, but to the company that allows that to happen.
Thank you. J'ai beaucoup de questions, alors je vais continuer avec...
I have a lot more questions. I will continue with Mr. Meunier. You've made some interesting recommendations, especially the two final points you mentioned. Changes to the criminal code to invest adequate resources when it comes to enforcing the law, but also annual reports that will give an idea of what is actually occurring. Your organization does good work, and you have a great deal of experience. To what point are we doing what we need to do in order to set up a system that works? Thank you for your question. The second point that you raised, on that, the idea of annual reports is that I've participated in many committees like this one. We don't have an idea of the entire continuum of conformity. We'll ask a question of the Department of Justice, they don't have the answer. That's why we think it would be worthwhile for all Canadians to have a better idea of what is happening with regards to the entire process from the beginning, namely detection, reports sent by banks and other financial institutions to FINTRAC, and find out what the result is along that long chain of events, all the way up to the prosecutor. For me, this is about accountability before parliamentary committees, but also before the Canadian public, to determine what is the investment we're making in terms of resources and what is the result that we get at the end. If we could break it down by province, that would be even better to get that kind of results. I'm not sure if I answered your question. Yes. In fact, we're talking about 250 million transactions, 250,000 transactions. Some were referred to the CRA, but we don't know what happened between FINTRAC to the Canada Revenue Agency. You worked in both locations. Is there communication on that? I can't really talk about what's being done today. I assume that it's correct to talk about communications being closer than they were previously. When the law changed in July 2010, the intent was to make tax evasion an underlying crime to money laundering. From that point, there was a great deal more disclosure and communication with the agency. But as far as I know, information and cooperation is very close.
Mr. Kemper, you're strong advocates and you have a good knowledge of cryptocurrency. Both of you mentioned detection of criminal activities, but I didn't sense any specific recommendations. Obviously, if we're moving more to blockchain, to cryptocurrency, we need recommendations as to how to identify criminal activity. What are the recommendations that you can make to us?
Sure, I'll go first. As I mentioned, you can think of the on-ramps or off-ramps, so that's exchanging Canadian dollars for Bitcoin and vice versa. And so that's where you could look at how you want financial reporting to be handled by these organizations. In terms of specific criminal activity, it just falls under the RCMP's jurisdiction, or, I mean, it could be different levels of police, but for federal crimes. And they're doing a great job. So they treat it like any internet crime that's not necessarily going to dig into the specifics of Bitcoin or the fact that a currency is being used.
Mr. Kemper?
I would say work with the exchanges. We have this, pulled out of thin air $10,000 number where every time a transaction is over 10,000 STR is submitted. That's leading to so much data going into FINTRAC that they're being completely swamped with data. The exchanges are the ones who are actually handling it. I worked with the exchanges. I've worked with many people in the industry. Look, we know we're the ones. We're the frontline warriors. Work with us towards building a better kind of communication system, better data towards actually making qualified STRs as opposed to just blanket anything over this number. And you can tie that back with digital identities and verified claims around things as well. That will lead to, I literally know that what the gentleman earlier was talking about there just being faxed off to the room. The cryptocurrencies and digital currencies are not included in the 20 boxes at the bottom of the STR form. If it was included and if it was partitioned and if you actually use blockchain behind it, you could have excellent actionable data. But currently it's literally going in the mail into a room and who knows if action's being taken on that. And, it's a daunting task and there's no way you could ever possibly have the resources to do that. But if you make it a little bit more and kind of maybe perhaps reward or incentivize action and good results and put in positive feedback loops, we will get to the bottom of identifying the criminal activities which are hurting society.
Thank you. We're at a time on that round. Mr. Sabara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, everyone. It's very insightful testimony. I'm not really sure if I understand blockchain or Bitcoin or cryptocurrency yet. But just starting off with Mr. Munir, if I pronounce your name correctly, Dennis. You seem to have some past experience with FinTrack, I believe, and you also mentioned CRA, if I'm correct. Is that correct? Just that and now you're over at Transparency International, which is wonderful, and I'm sure they're leveraging your experience. Where are we if you had to provide a quote or two about where Canada is in this whole transparency, anti-money laundering, effectiveness worldwide, say against our G7 partners or G20, where would we rank today in your view?
Thank you for your question. 3 or 4 words, we're behind the 8 ball, and we're going to continue being behind the 8 ball because the world trend is going to publicly accessible beneficial ownership registry. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, in a couple of months, we expect that the European Union is going to make a publicly accessible beneficial ownership available within the whole EU. And we can't remember. We should remember they are a new partner, new trade partner, and people who want to invest here also want to know who they're dealing with. And I think if they might think of putting a little more pressure because the international standard, in my view, will change in a couple of years.
In your view, because you've worked for federal agencies, being FinTrack and CRA, and Mr. Russell may be able to chime in on this as well, or if he may wishes to do so, setting up a accessible beneficial registry. Are there any jurisdictional issues in being able to do that in Canada because we don't have a national securities regulator yet? And are there anything preventing that from being done here in Canada?
You're addressing your question to...
First Dennis and then to Ian.
Well, the Minister of Finance is working very closely with the provinces on this, according to his announcement back in December, and we're very happy to hear that. There are obviously some challenges, I'm sure. The trade agreement, the interprovincial trade agreement of 1994 was made with the commitment of all provinces and the federal government to harmonize this. This has been a long time coming, so yeah, there'll be some definitional issues and systems issues and jurisdictional issues, but for the betterment of our own protection of our own public interest here, I think that I encourage the governments to make it accessible publicly.
Monsieur Munier makes a very, very good point about the importance of this registry, and I'm a bit concerned that when I saw the announcements by the government, they were talking more about transparency of the system and standardization, which are very important, but maybe putting insufficient emphasis on a registry, an accessible registry. That certainly was in the white paper, and I think that should carry a lot more priority. To your point about jurisdiction, there isn't a jurisdictional issue here. We're just simply talking about an agreement across the provinces to come to some agreement in harmonizing the threshold levels for beneficial ownership. I think everybody would benefit from having a uniform registry, and as the Attorney General of BC had said, if you leave one province out, then you're going to create distortions in the market. So you need everybody to play. But the other option here too, in getting ahead of it, is you could build these things. I noticed that the Attorney General talked about a BC registry. With technology today, you can link these registries together. And what I was most intrigued about was Monsieur Munier's point. He's much more of an expert on this area than I am, but when he talked about the initiative to develop a more international database, and this isn't something that's unprecedented. We already have the CRS system for tax reporting. We now file tax reports on non-residents in Canada into a central deposit repository. The OECD oversees that. So there are precedents in place to do it. I think Canada can move quickly. Agreed that we have 2 levels of government, but I think we could do it.
Stop there because I do want to have a follow-up question.
One quick one, Francesco.
Mr. Winter, the Attorney General from BC, in his very thoughtful testimony earlier today, talked about the lack of, I don't want to quote him because I don't want to quote him wrong, but the lack of enforcement. That there's mechanisms there, be it for FINTRAC or so forth, but there's a lack of enforcement going on in terms of transactions being reported. And he kind of used the analogy of someone at FINTRAC receiving a fax of a transaction over $10,000, but then nothing happening afterwards. And on the enforcement side, there seems to be some lack there. And going back to the RCMP report from 2009, where they estimate $15 billion of money being laundered in Canada, which is probably not a conservative estimate, I would say. How do you feel about the enforcement from your past experience with FINTRAC and CRA, now with Transparency International?
I think that, thank you for your question, and I think that enforcement is an issue, but it's not enforcement alone, it's prosecution as well. In the case of the minister who was speaking before us, I think he made some very good points. I might disagree with him in terms of the way he characterized the information being sent to FINTRAC as faxed and in paper boxes. That's obviously an exaggeration to make a point. However, back to your question on enforcement, I do think that it really has to be looked at because there's, like I say, if you just take a look at the annual report from FINTRAC, it'll tell you how many thousands of disclosures to law enforcement has been made across this country, but you won't see an equivalent. Even if it's 25% would end up in criminal investigations and prosecutions. For sure, they're all in, I'm convinced that all of these cases are being investigated, but are they actually being prosecuted? And that's where I think it falls in terms of, I know that FINTRAC has produced a report for which I received access to information, and from the year 2000 to the year 2014, they provided a sample of 40 cases, convictions. So I don't know if that was the total amount of convictions for money laundering over the 14-year period or not. They might be able to expand on that because they did say it was a sample, but that's not a lot.
Okay, thank you all. Turning to Mr. Albas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank each one of our witnesses. I may not get a chance to directly interface you, but I certainly would just say I think we've all benefited by your presence and certainly appreciate the comments and expertise you have today. I'll start with Real Estate Association. Thank you for your presentation. Just in regard to almost every conversation I've had with many of your members in my constituency often, sometimes here in Ottawa, I will hear the common refrain that FINTRAC is a big pain in my tuchus, and they just complain about it endlessly, saying that there's a lot of paperwork. Now, FINTRAC has come here, and obviously they have very important work to do, and I don't think either of you would say that it's not important work. Has FINTRAC met with you to discuss ways that your industry can comply more efficiently, or in any suggestions? I think you said when it's been a one-way street, and you're not sure whether or not they've listened. Is that correct?
Am I taking? So I think there's a number of ways that I think we could work better with FINTRAC, or FINTRAC could work better with us in order to get to where everyone wants to go, which is fighting money laundering. You're correct. We recognize that there's money laundering in the real estate sector in Canada, and our members play a role. But there's a lot that they can do. They can give us tools in order to get where they want to go. And one example would be more meaningful outreach. So we do meet with them on occasion, but it's not regular. It can be a struggle sometimes to meet with them. When we do meet with them, we ask for policy interpretation. Sometimes we email them policy interpretations, and it's great that we can do that. But when we get a response, which sometimes can take many, many months, which is not helpful, the policy interpretations we get can be vague, or require further confirmation from them of what they exactly mean. They might just quote us the legislation again. They might not use the language that real estate brokers and salespersons use, which is really important. A one-size-fits-all and just using generic language is not helpful, not a helpful policy interpretation. So that's something else that we could get. Also, there may be instances where clear and specific regulation and guidance that is tailored to the real estate industry might be necessary. We're seeing this on the guidance side right now. FINTRAC is looking at updating their suspicious transaction reporting guidance, and it's supposed to be what we're looking at right now is core guidance, which is applicable to all sectors. But if you look at the language, a high percentage is geared at financial institutions. So there's lots of ways that we think we can benefit.
And I certainly
sit in here for a minute.
To follow up on the question that you asked, it seems to me the response that you got to your question about questioning the burden of complying with the FINTRAC and the FINTRAC regulations or the Act, the response seemed to be related more to getting greater clarity, whatever, from the FINTRAC people. Well, I represent an industry that has 123 members in it. And there's 80 firms that probably have, on average, maybe 20 professional employees. So these are very small securities dealers that carry the full burden of compliance with FINTRAC. Now you say, how do we do that? Because that's a big burden on very small securities firms, regional firms across the country. And the reason why they can do it is there's a lot of technology out there to enable compliance. Third-party entities, vendors that provide a lot of this technology to assist in the compliance. So I would just mention that, yes, there are issues with FINTRAC. We don't have the same level of communication we would like, and that's another issue. But certainly, we find that we've got very small members that are able to comply with those regulations.
Go ahead, Mr.
Okay.
Albus.
Thank you for that, and maybe I'll add this in because, as from my viewpoint, and I should just be fair to FINTRAC, they actually are no longer the first thing that comes out of real estate people, professionals, because there's now a regulator in BC that's being set up. So right now, when I talk to real estate, they are actually well ahead of FINTRAC in terms of complaints, at least in my mind. So right now, FINTRAC, though, to be fair to them, are legislatively restrained from sharing information of any sort outside of what has been determined by law, by Parliament. Would, if amendments were made to FINTRAC allowing them to give forward regulatory guidance to deal with what Mr. Russell's saying, as well as your data outline where some of the issues are, so that there's a better understanding. And plus, as I mentioned to the Minister from British Columbia, if FINTRAC was given authorization to aggregate the data, so no personal privacy was waived, but would allow real estate professionals who actually go through those efforts to give that information to FINTRAC, would actually have a return where they would be able to know what the market is doing, how many private cash sales. Would that something your organization be in favor of? And I'll also extend that as well to Mr. Russell.
I think so, but actually, they have given us some information, actually, and so it's just been anecdotal. But if they feel that they can't give us more without a legislative or regulatory amendment, then certainly, yes, anything that would facilitate a more of a two-way conversation would certainly be of benefit.
Mr. Russell?
Yes. Well, first of all, I think there certainly is a lack of communication, and you're citing the legislation. I do know that there is not a problem under the privacy laws because we're talking about specific transactions with specific dealers who already have that privacy obligation. But the other point that I wanted to make, kind of related to that, it seems to me there, and Mr. Meunier talked about it in his testimony, is there isn't sufficient transparency to know exactly what is happening with FINTRAC and the responsibilities they're engaged in. And it seems to me, for example, from my members' point of view, it's not clear whether there's sufficient resources at FINTRAC to manage the transactions, whether there's some reason why They are not communicating back. There's no information on prosecutions, no information on actual convictions. And it seems to me that that information, while much of it may not be publicly or shouldn't be made public, some of it could be, some may not be, it seems that government could come to grips with it because there's some important public policy questions that need to be raised.
Okay, coming over to Mr. McLeod, but I'd ask this question. We're using as the basically we're using the document of February 7th from the Department of Finance as kind of the foundation for our hearing. Is there any glaring problems in terms of that discussion paper that you want to present to us? If there is, then we should know.
Here's what I found on the web for any glaring problem.
My thing's talking to me. Is there? So if there, that's better than blockchain, Cal. But if there is any glaring problems, then relay them to us because we should know that. So you can think about that, and we can come back to it. Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank everyone for their presentations. We had the Auditor General present prior to everybody coming to the table, and he really opened my eyes on as to the extent of the problem in the sector of casinos and gambling, and he pointed out that in British Columbia the issue is not restricted to casinos, and he made the reference to looking at the real estate as part of their next round of review. And so I wanted to ask the people that are here from the real estate sector, if there is, do you think in your own assessment that there is an issue with money laundering in the whole area of real estate? And if there is, how widespread is it?
So we do recognize there is an issue with money laundering in the real estate sector. We share the concerns when we see media reports in the news about money laundering in whatever city in Vancouver or elsewhere in Canada. That concerns us. And that is why we take very seriously the obligations that are imposed on our members. So as my colleague Dina mentioned in her opening remarks, we have prepared numerous materials. We prepared template forms, office compliance manuals. We communicate regularly with our members on specific issues that are brought to our attention, such as the need to do a training program or the need to file suspicious transaction reports. So it is a concern to us, but at the same time, we're also concerned that the manner in which obligations are being imposed on our members may not be the most efficient or best way that's actually could be done. In terms of how much, unfortunately, we don't know how much. If we knew how much money laundering was going on the real estate sector, I think there'd be another issue. So we don't know those numbers.
Thank you. And you also, in the presentation, it was mentioned that although you're meeting your FINTRAC requirements, and it looks like it's a huge task to embark on, but you said that a lot of times the information never sees the light of day. What do you think the percentages of that are? Is it more than half? Is it three-quarters?
Thank you for the question. It's not necessarily data. What we can explain is that a realtor has to ID their client and fill out several forms for each transaction. That information is filed away and usually never seen by FINTRAC. So what FINTRAC will see is a large cash transaction and a suspicious transaction. All the other files that the members have to fill out and brokers have to fill out are not seen by FINTRAC. So that's where the frustration comes from.
Thank you. And we've heard a lot about the rules and the burden of having to oblige the government in filling out all the requirements, but we never talked about, and we talked about suspicious transactions and the $10,000 limit, but we never talked about the penalties. Do we, and the FATF had done a review and identified making penalties related to money laundering and terrorism financing more proportionate and dissuasive as something to consider. Is it something, maybe you could all answer this, if you support that, And should we be looking at stiffer penalties?
So there can be cases where penalties are warranted, so we don't have a specific example where we would say you should adjust it one way or the other. But I think it's important to recall what's the objective of this legislation, and that is to detect and deter money laundering. The reporting entities, such as brokers and salespersons, are not the ultimate target. It is the money launderers who are the ultimate target. So sometimes the discussion on the compliance burden or are the penalties on them enough, I think sometimes that distracts from the real issue, which is what can we do to encourage more STRs, more suspicious transaction reports to be made in order to give FINTRAC what it wants.
Anybody else?
I think my colleague has expressed it well. There is a regime of penalties at this point, and I think the penalties that might have been referred to in terms of the FATF, and I may be correct, is perhaps the effort that is put in prosecution and trading off predicate offense for money laundering offenses. I'm assuming that. I could be wrong, but at this point I don't know that we need to increase the penalties on the compliance side.
It just seems to me that maybe the challenge is more around the detection of an actual money laundering transaction, and then the other issue is the prosecution and how difficult it is, as opposed to an actual conviction and then a penalty and then a recurrence of the crime. I don't think we're that far out. I think we're still sitting back saying, well, how effective is detection within FINRA, and how successful are they at prosecution? I mean, those seem to me the bigger uncertain questions.
Okay, Mr. Albas, and then back to one more on this side. Greg? Okay.
Yeah. So I do think we've heard from a number of different industries that are subject to FINTRAC that there are administrative compliance costs in terms of time and data collection, et cetera. Now, when I broached this directly with FINTRAC, they said they do not track the administrative compliance cost because they know what they do is important, but they're more focused on the efficacy of their efforts, not necessarily the efficiency. And I'm a big believer you cannot manage something if you cannot measure it. Would you be in favor of industry by industry when FINTRAC does, there should be an inventory about roughly how much time it takes to do it? Because to me, then you would have an emphasis to try to reduce compliance costs, which I think ultimately benefits everyone. If there's greater compliance, greater efficiency, chances the system will improve. So I'll just put it out to any of the groups here. Maybe we start with Mr. Russell.
Well, I can appreciate that FINTRAC doesn't put that as a priority, but on the other hand, if there is a suggestion or an idea or a concept that, if put in place, can actually reduce the costs to the people who are complying, FINTRAC should not stand in the way of that, but more importantly, it should be pushing and encouraging that. The Central Registry on Beneficial Ownership would be one example. The other big example for my industry is moving forward with some kind of a mutual recognition scheme for foreign institutions that are transacting in Canada to if they're in an acceptable jurisdiction, you shouldn't have to go through the identity. These are sort of initiatives that make a lot of sense, and it's just an inertia on the part of government, it seems to me, not to move forward with it, but it would relieve the burden, certainly for my industry, if we could have their active, proactive support.
So I would suggest that they're not going to want to have measurement and statistics about their efficiency because they're not doing a good job, because they're inundated with information. I think we need to consciously and critically think about the goals of these organizations and start thinking about the fact that we have electricity and we don't need to be thinking about candles anymore. And we need to think about how we redesign these entire systems to be very, very efficient and very seamless and not even require centralized authorities to oversee it all. And that is the potential that blockchain brings to us. And it works for FINTRAC, but it also works for real estate, it works for identity, it works for taxation, it works for monetary policy. But we now have this changing time, and we need to address at a very high level how are we going to move forward as a country? How are we going to move forward as a civilization? Are we going to try and take this new technology and hem it into the previous paradigm, or are we going to embrace it and ascend into the new age? And to that end, I think there's a need for a national blockchain strategy or a task force with decision-making power, with the ability to make mistakes, with the ability to work with international partners, with the ability to try things, to implement pilots. One of the things that we've done with the Blockchain Association is worked with the supercluster. So we put in a bid for superclusters, but we're a horizontal industry spread out everywhere, representing global interest. Tons of support. Everybody's supported. We continued by putting letters of support to all the successful or all the finalist superclusters and all those the ones that got selected. And we're looking forward to working with each of them towards bringing together all the stakeholders, towards identifying and understanding the challenges that industries face at a multi-stakeholder level. You can't, as a government, tell the industry how to do. The industry can't tell the government how to do things. Collectively, you must agree and then work together towards implementing these new solutions. Be afraid to make mistakes. Understand that we don't know everything, and then we move forward.
Sorry, Mr. Munya.
From Transparency International Canada, certainly our goal is ensuring greater transparency. If it comes with efficiency and savings and compliance, we're all for it. And certainly beneficial ownership registry that's publicly accessible will help all of the reporting entities, all of them. And that will reduce their cost. And certainly if there's other measures that can be implemented that will facilitate compliance, well, even better, because then it might encourage more compliance and more transparency and better detection and conviction.
The question's not really within my expertise, so I'll defer to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. On this, we don't have data for all of our members, but we do know that complying with FINTRAC would cost between $10,000 and $100,000 for different reporting entities. So small businesses, 1 or 2 people operation, could cost up to $10,000, and that doesn't include all the time that they spend filling out the form. So definitely, if we can work with FINTRAC to be a little bit more efficient, bring down the cost, compliance will go up, and we would be pleased to work with FINTRAC.
Great, thank you.
Coming to Ms. O'Connell, but Mr. Clark, that question wasn't within your expertise. But can blockchain be used as a tool to deal with some of the problems we talked about here in terms of money laundering precedes a crime and how as it relates to FINTRAC? And if so, how?
Sure. So you can think of a blockchain as sort of providing database-like structures. The only difference is that you don't have to decide who holds that database. So instead of anointing one person to sort of, and so you sidestep the kind of governance issue of who's going to hold that data. It also has very strong technical properties in terms of what data can be written. The data that's written will be validated according to sets of rules that you can write. You can write it in software or in code. So to the extent that you could think of a computer being able to record this information or even act on this information, then a blockchain could be dropped in to provide that same functionality, and it could be done in a way that you don't have to pick one person that's going to be in charge of running that database. So it is a relevant technology. There's lots of open questions, a lot of research questions before you can just drop one in.
Okay, thank you. Nothing but been complicated. Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually wanted to ask a question to the Real Estate Association, so whomever you feel is best to answer. I've heard you in terms of the compliance issues and the paperwork, and I think it was well said in terms of, being nitpicky on the things that really don't contribute to what we're all trying to deal with here. So have you given any thought to if the compliance still has to be there. There's obviously a huge risk in terms of the real estate market for money laundering. So if the compliance were streamlined, I think is probably a safe way to put it. If it was streamlined, but how do we ensure that real estate agents are actually doing this work. I knew my real estate agent when I bought my house, so he knew who I was and, didn't really have to do much of the background. Of course, I still signed all the papers and they go through all of that. But I'm from the GTA. We had the Attorney General from BC. Homes are selling within hours in certain cases. How are we ensuring that the agents themselves are actually getting to know their clients? How do we do that, or how do we feel secure in doing that if the compromise is to somehow streamline the process as well? Have you given any thought to that?
Well, at first I would mention that the legislation and the regulations already include some measures which do encourage compliance, such as fines, AMPs. There was also recently specific obligations introduced to basically require brokers and agents to document every step of the way. They're called reasonable measure records. So there are some things in place, but I do think that you can streamline some areas where some of the obligations that are imposed just don't really make sense. For example, we have a policy interpretation from FINTRAC which says, okay, you have an obligation to know who your client is, and if you do repeat business with them, you have an obligation to make sure that, say, their occupation hasn't changed. But what if you're doing two transactions concurrently? Basically, what FINTRAC has told us is, if you ask someone what their job is, say they're a plumber, and you're doing another transaction, you have to ask them again, oh, you know how a minute ago I asked if you're a plumber? We want to know, are you still a plumber? Which makes no sense. So if we had a policy interpretation which recognized how real estate actually is being conducted, which is people often buy and sell homes at the same time or in a very short period, and there is no need necessarily to ask the exact same question, such as did your date of birth change or did your occupation change, I think that would be a way that FINTRAC would have more credibility, and we can say, look, what they're really asking is they want to make sure that you know who you're dealing with, which, again, we don't have an issue with, that we know we have a role, but it has to make sense.
Thank you.
Okay, I see no other burning questions unless we okay. Then thank you very much to the witnesses. I would say that I know the Department of Finance is looking for feedback on that discussion paper as well. And if you are presenting papers to the Department of Finance, it might be helpful to send us a copy as well so that we're not working at cross purposes in case you think of something in the meantime, and just forward it to the clerk and we'll be sure to get it. So we've covered quite a number of bases this afternoon here. Thank each and every one of you for your presentation, and with that, meeting adjourned.